Welcome to week 33 of our second year of our journey through the Word. This week we continue to listen to Solomon's wisdom. And in 1 Kings 4, verse 32, we're told that Solomon actually wrote more than 3,000 proverbs. As we look at the book of Proverbs, obviously it doesn't contain all his proverbs. And the book of Proverbs is actually divided into 3 sections. Chapters 1 through 9, which we've already looked at, is the foundation of Proverbs. It tells us why he wrote it, what inspired him to write it, and what are the benefits of the wisdom he shares. Then as we look at Proverbs 10 through chapter 24, we find that this is the second section of Proverbs. And now he goes into the actual Proverbs, which are those short statements. And then we have the third division in the book of Proverbs, which is Proverbs 25 through 31. In Proverbs 25, verse 1, we're told, "These are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, transcribed." If we look at the word transcribed, we find that the word transcribed literally means they were moved. And so in the first 2 sections, these are the Proverbs the way Solomon had composed them. But in chapters 25 through 31, now we see Proverbs that the men of Hezekiah's time gleaned from other writings that Solomon had and put them together as a part of the book of Proverbs. In this section, in chapters 25 and on, we begin to see the similes of the Proverbs. So what's a simile? A simile is a figure of speech that compares one thing with something that's different, but yet would give it more understanding or give it a depth of understanding. For example, we've seen the righteous are bold as a lion. Usually these figures of speech will have the word as or like in them. So the righteous are bold as a lion. And so if we look at a lion, there is so much we can learn about the boldness of a lion. So it takes all this understanding and brings it down into this one little phrase. So actually, these short similes are messages all in themselves. Again, as we look at another example that's here in Proverbs 25, it says, "Like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold is a wise reprover to a listening ear." And so once again, we see that there is a greater lesson, that there is what does an ornament of gold do, and what are earrings of gold for? And so there are more lessons that can be learned than just the obvious looking at our earring or a necklace. And so these similes, we will see them quite frequently as we go through this part of the Proverbs. But one of the things about the Proverbs, as well as many of the scriptures throughout the Bible, is that we can miss the fullness of the lesson if we don't understand the culture it was written in, or the audience it was written to, or the climate or terrain of those who it's written to. Let me give you some examples. In Proverbs 25:13, we're told, "Like the cold of snow in the day of harvest is a faithful messenger to those who send him, for he refreshes the soul of his master." I want you to pay attention, special attention, to those first words, "like the cold of snow in the day of harvest." If I don't understand the day of harvest and only look at it from, say, in the north, we used to live in Michigan, and the day of harvest is very much different in Michigan than the day of harvest in Israel. The day of harvest in New Zealand is much different than the day of harvest in Israel. And so we have to look at these words and get their full effect by looking at the climate and the time of year that it's speaking about, because it's speaking about the time of harvest. The grain and vegetable harvest in Israel is in a very difficult time, because if we look at this chart that I'm giving you, the chart shows you the seasons. And so you'll see that they do much of their harvest time in the summertime. And in the summertime, you're talking about a desert climate. Now, if we look at the northeastern or southeastern part, or even the Midwest part of the United States, their harvest time, we look forward to those nice, beautiful, warm summer days. But Israel's harvest time is more like what we have here in Phoenix, Arizona. Probably one of the reasons I fell in love with Phoenix is because it reminded me so much of Israel. We are a desert mountain region, just like Israel. And our harvest times, and the harvest times in Israel, are hot and dry, with an average temperature of around 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. And what they would do is that they would, in the wintertime, when it would snow on the mountains, they would take the snow and they would store it in underground places so that it would stay until the hotter days of summer. And so when it talks about snow in the time of harvest, it's talking even about the difficulty of that snow being brought to them in a time of harvest. It wasn't that it was impossible. It was possible. And when you think about, again, the time of harvest, the extreme heat, the extreme dry conditions, we will understand even more so when it says how it refreshes those who sent them. You see, because in the desert, here in Phoenix, as well as over in Israel, the summertime is a very dangerous time of year because of it being hot and dry. If we have people who come to Phoenix, again, and I'm very sure same thing happens in Israel all the time. People go in the summertime not understanding the dangers of extreme hot and extreme dry. And so they think that they're going to go take a hike, let's say late in the morning or early afternoon. And as they're hiking, they find that they begin to have heat exhaustion. You know that you're starting to have heat exhaustion, first the thirst, then you get headaches and nausea and dizziness, and then weakness. And then once the heat exhaustion comes in, then the danger of the more serious heat stroke can happen quickly. And often people are totally unaware of it. And this, when heat stroke happens, no longer can the body regulate and control its temperature. And so the body can't cool down. The sweating mechanism fails, and no longer can the body bring the temperature down. And so the body temperature can elevate up to 106 degrees within 10 to 15 minutes. And this heat stroke is deadly. And so when we look at this verse where it says, like the cold of snow in the day of harvest, we see that how do you bring a body temperature down? Well, the way you bring a body temperature down is you put it in cold, ice cold water and have them drink in ice water so that you can bring the core temperature of the body down. So when it's talking about like the cold of snow in the day of harvest, it's talking about extreme measures. It's talking about having to bring those body temperatures down quickly. And so we have to know that certainly in the land of Israel, the ancients would have known all about heat exhaustion and also heat stroke. And you might even remember in Elisha's time when there was the little boy that was out harvesting with his father, and he grabs his head and he says, "Oh, my head, my head." What was happening? I have no doubt if we could go back into that time, we would find that the little boy was either struggling with heat exhaustion and then heat stroke, because it was in the day of harvest. And again, it would have been in that hot, dry time. And so again, listen to these words with this understanding in Proverbs 25:13. Like the cold of snow in the day of harvest is a faithful messenger to those who send him, for he refreshes the soul of his master. And so we see that it's talking about the seriousness of the message that the master is waiting for. And this is a life and death situation. And so we see the seriousness of the effects of the heat on a midsummer harvest day. And then as we look at Proverbs 25:25, we see a proverb that's similar to it. And it says, like cold water to a weary soul, so is good news from a distant land. Now, you notice that it doesn't talk about the extreme heat of the harvest time. And yet now we see someone who is thirsty. We're not talking about heat stroke, maybe even not even heat exhaustion. We're just talking about someone who is thirsty. And thirstiness brings weariness. And so now we see that good news is like someone who is sitting and they're thirsty, and someone brings them a cool drink of water. This time it's not ice. This time it's a cool drink of water. Someone brings you that glass of lemonade. How refreshing that is. And it says, so when good news comes from a distant land, it's so refreshing. A good example of this would be like in the story of Jacob, when he left his mother and father, when he left Rebekah and Isaac, and he goes to Haran. Can you imagine what a cool glass of water would be, or what a refreshing it would be when someone would bring Rebekah news about her son who was so far away? And so this is the kind of refreshing that this is talking about. So one speaks of extreme danger and waiting for news. The other speaks of weariness, of wanting to hear something about someone that they love. That brings us to another example of the loss of understanding, if we, again, don't see it in context of the culture and climate it's written in. In Proverbs 25:14, we're told, like clouds and wind without rain is a man who boasts of his gifts falsely. We really understand the extent of this when once again we look at what it means to be like clouds and wind without rain. Now, if I were to interpret this from, say, the climate of New Zealand, where it's always rainy, there's always a good rain here and there. That's why New Zealand is so lush and beautiful and green. And again, when we go back to Israel, we know that from May to September is the hot, dry season. The average rainfall in the South Arabah is 1 inch a year. And as we move up towards Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, their average rainfall is about 13 inches or 33 centimeters. And so that's just a little over a foot of rain for the whole year. And then we have New Zealand, which around Auckland area, it has nearly 50 inches of rainfall in a year. And so when we look at this, like clouds and wind without rain, we have to look at it from the climate it's written to and written in. So this is again, desert mountain. It doesn't get much rain. And if you can imagine that if you were a farmer and if you had planted your crops, and your planting of the crops would be more like in March, April. And so you've planted your crops and you need rain. In the harvest time, you're not going to get much. But in that growing time, you've got to have some rain. And so if there isn't any rain that's coming, you know you're not going to have a harvest. You're not going to have crops come. And not only do your plantings and does your seed need rain, but people need rain. You see, because in a desert mountain region, which we experience this often here in the Phoenix area, with the lack of vegetation like you would have in climates that have much rain, and they have grass everywhere. When we lived up in Michigan, we had plenty of grass, and we had nice crops that would come in. And so if there was a wind that would blow, it might make rustling noises in the trees, but it didn't affect your air quality so much. Where here in the Phoenix area and also in Israel, if there's wind, it's going to pick up, and I'm talking even slight wind, it will pick up dust particles because there's no grass that's keeping the dust particles down. So you get these tiny little dust particles in the air. And these particulates, which are suspended dust particles in the air, reduce your air quality. And as a result, what they have found is that when there's more and more particulates in the air, it affects people. They become irritated and may not even know why they feel agitated or irritated. And so we look forward to a good rain coming through, and also the wind that would come through, because what it's going to do is that it's going to cleanse the air. It's always amazing after a good rain how when we go outside, not only can you see that now the air is clean, you can smell it. There's just a different smell about it. And it's so refreshing when you go out after a rain. And so rain and wind are air purifiers, and it's not only good for the land, but it's good for the people. But can you imagine, again, if you live in this kind of climate, you know you've got to have rain. The air needs cleaned. The earth needs watered. And so to see a cloud in the distance would begin to bring you hope. Oh, finally, we're going to get some rain. And so you see the rain coming in, and you're excited. You do get, let me tell you, in these desert regions, you get excited about rain clouds. And so you see the rain clouds coming in. And then, as you know, right before the rain comes, you'll feel this wind pick up. And so again, your hope builds. There's clouds, there's wind, the rain is coming. And then you watch the rain clouds pass overhead. The wind comes through. Instead of cleaning things out, it picks up more dust particles and puts more dust in the air. And so instead of a cleansing and a refreshing, it brings disappointment. It brings more agitation. And now you have a bigger mess than before it came. When we have these kinds of things come through the Phoenix area, especially if it comes with a strong wind, when it leaves a mess. Not only has it not cleansed the air, but it's caused those dust particles to come through the crevices and cracks of the windows. And I don't care how tight you think your house is sealed up, those dust particles come in, and now you get up and you look and there's dust over everything, and you have a bigger mess. So when it tells us, like clouds and wind without rain is a man who boasts of his gifts falsely, what it's saying is they give a promise and a hope, and yet when they leave, there is a bigger mess. And it is far more disappointing. And so we see this message is more extensive when it's looked at in the climate that it's given in. And as we continue to learn from Solomon, we continue to hear him expound on the levels of fools as we continue even in this third portion of the Proverbs. In Proverbs 26, verses 1 through 12, there is a detailed description of a fool. But what kind of fool is this? Well, once again, if we do a word study, we find that this kind of a fool that's being described in these verses is the fool that's known as a kasil. And then we have some verses in Proverbs 27. Listen to Proverbs 27 and verse 3. A stone is heavy and the sand weighty, but the provocation of a fool is heavier than both of them. And also in verse 22, though you pound a fool in a mortar with a pestle, along with crushed grain, yet his foolishness will not depart from him. Again, we see the word fool here, but in Proverbs 27, in both of these instances, this is not the fool that is a kasil. This is the fool that is an evil. And so, again, we've looked at the differences between a kasil and an evil. But to help you in your aid and even in your reading through these scriptures, for those who like a more in-depth study, let me give you a way that has helped me to be able to read through the Proverbs and get more out of it. Often at the end of a book, for instance, at the end of the book of Proverbs, you might, at the end of your book of Proverbs, you might find a blank area on the last page, and sometimes it's a full page. And what I have done in that blank area is I have written out the definitions of each type of fool so that I would have a quick reference, and you can see a picture of that here. And then what I've done is I have assigned a color to each one of those categories. And then as I have gone through the book of Proverbs, I have done the keyword search so that I can identify which kind of fool is being spoken about. So if you do a keyword search in any Bible program or in a concordance such as the Strong's Concordance, you can begin to identify which verse has which kind of a fool. And then as I've gone through the Proverbs, I have noted or underlined or color-coded that word fool, so I know which kind of fool is it talking about. And so as you see my example here in Proverbs 26, you see that the verses for the kasil are underlined in the olive green. And then in Proverbs 27, I have assigned the turquoise distinction to the evil. So as I'm reading, I can immediately know, is this a kasil fool or is this an evil fool? And if I've forgotten, so what was the description of a kasil? I can go to the end of Proverbs, and right there I have a quick reference to what are the characteristics of that kind of fool. So I can have a quick refreshing of my memory, and it causes me to have a greater understanding. Now, this kind of study, it takes time and it takes discipline. But the reward of this greater kind of study brings a greater understanding, and it brings a priceless understanding to the word. Well, we have only 18 more weeks to go in our journey through the Word, and I trust that what you're learning as you go through our journey this time makes you want to return to those that you have journeyed with and that you have walked with. I pray that you're looking forward to coming back to the book of Proverbs. You may not be able to do all these things on your first time through your study, but I hope it's causing you to say, oh, I look forward to coming back to Proverbs and spending more time with Solomon as he tells me more about the levels of a fool, or gives me more understanding in his similes. And perhaps it is even causing you to linger longer with some of the other biblical hosts that you have walked with in this first journey through the Word. And for many of you, maybe this is your second, third, 10th, whatever. I pray that this journey through the Word that we have been on has caused a hunger to finish out this journey and then begin again. So once again, enjoy your journey this week. And I will see you again next week.